All right, we're on our YouTube folks. Hopefully there's some folks joining us today right now, or others who will come and look at it later on this week. We're glad that you're a part of our gathering today as we turn to the book of Acts once more, to chapter 27. We will finish up our study next week with the last chapter in the book of Acts, and then we're going to take the month of August off before we come back in September, and we will pick up with the book of Hebrews in September. So August will be off, everybody on their month-long vacation wherever, and then we'll gather back in September for our study on the book of Hebrews. Remember that last week we talked about the trial before King Agrippa. King Agrippa, the figurehead king of the Jews in that time, he and some of the leading men of Caesarea were gathered together in order to hear the case, Paul's case, one more time. They were trying to come up with some reason to charge Paul, and of course they weren't able to charge Paul, but Paul had already made an appeal to go to the emperor to have his case heard at the highest courts of the land. And so that's what we're all about now, is Paul making his journey to Rome. The whole of chapter 27 and part of chapter 28 tell us about that journey. We get a lot of detail from Luke, who is the author of the book of Acts, on this. Scholars have wondered why he spent so much time. You know, there are parts of the book of Acts where, you know, he just says he went from this place to this place and he doesn't say anything more. Why in the world does he go into such detail here? Well, number one, it's a pretty fascinating story. It's an incredible story, incredible in the sense of amazing, so it, you know, and when you read it, it really does engage you. It's like we've said about all of these last couple of chapters, it's great drama, and we see the life of Paul in play in some very diverse but also distressing, dangerous circumstances. So there's the dramatic element of it as well. But most of all, I think it can be said that Luke is spending so much time talking about this story because he wants to drive home one central point, and that is that God is meaning to take Paul to Rome to preach the gospel there before the emperor's court, and you know, nothing is going to change that. Nothing's going to keep that from taking place. And so the story, as we read it, you know, is going to highlight the fact that God overcomes all the circumstances that would have kept him from going to Rome. God overcomes them and does so in a miraculous way so that Paul will get to Rome. God's purposes will not be thwarted. Remember, really, this whole section of the book of Acts begins on Paul's journey home, the third missionary journey, and he's heading home. And every place he goes as he's heading home, he wants to go back to Jerusalem, and everybody's saying, don't go, don't go, don't go. You're going to get arrested. You know, something bad's going to happen to you. And Paul knows it's going to be rough. He knows he's going to be persecuted. But he has a sense of divine purpose, and that divine purpose is for him to get to Rome. And all that happens to him over the course of, you know, chapters 21 through the end of the book, all of them have to do with how, you know, God's call upon his life culminates in this going to Rome and preaching the gospel there. Pick up with the text, start the story. When it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, the we means, of course, that Luke is in this party. When it was decided that we were to set sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And we don't know anything about Julius. Centurion, he's a military leader of some sort, some high rank, evidently, obviously deemed to be a trustworthy soldier, a good leader, somebody who can handle this task. We're told that he's supposed to transfer Paul and some other prisoners. We don't know who those other prisoners are. We don't know if they're other Christians. We wonder because he's going to mention Aristarchus here in a second. Aristarchus is somebody you've heard of before, early in the book of Acts in chapter 19, where there's the riot in Ephesus. Aristarchus, when they can't find Paul, they take it out on Aristarchus and another of the disciples. And then in chapter 20, I think it is, 20, when Paul is making his way toward Caesarea, towards Jerusalem, Aristarchus is named in the party of those who are sailing with him heading back home. So we don't know if Aristarchus is one of those prisoners. We don't know if they're all Christians who are prisoners. We don't know if there's, who else is involved. We're just told that Paul and other prisoners are being transported to Italy. Verse 2, embarking on a ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail for the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea, that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. So stop there and take a look at your map if you've got one. I hope you picked up one, and you can kind of trace what we're talking about here. And these are all details that you just read right over all the time. I know you do, because I do it too. But it's good to stop and kind of pay attention to this. So go back up to verse 2, embarking on a ship of the Adramyttium. Adramyttium is a port. If you look on your map, the northwest coastline of Asia there, if you look up towards Troy and Troas and Azos, it's up there in that general vicinity. Adramyttium is a coastal town, and it evidently had a particular type of boat that was a coastal kind of boat. It wasn't meant to go out into the sea, and for big voyages, but rather was a coastal runner that would go from port to port, carrying supplies or carrying persons from one port to another, but it would stay close to the coastline. So embarking on a ship from Adramyttium that was about to set sail for the ports along the coast of Asia, and you can see that ring of ports along the coast there of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. We just mentioned him a second ago. The next day we put in at Sidon. So you go down to your map, you see where the red line starts in Caesarea. They go to Sidon. They're going up the coast in this boat to Sidon. There, Paul is able to go and visit some of the Christians there. Julius is congenial towards Paul. Paul has been a house prisoner, so it's not like he has to doubt that Paul is, be afraid that Paul's going to escape. He knows that Paul has been under house arrest. He knows that Paul has been, with fellow believers and other friends and disciples along the way, and so he allows him the freedom to go do that. Verse 4, putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. Now, as I understand it, I don't know that term well. Lee, it just means the sheltered part of the island. And so you see how they sail up there under the word Pamphylia along the coast there on the northern side of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So they're having to find the most direct way to get to go against the wind to deal with the weather as it's coming. And so that's the trek they're taking. The winds are against them, and so they're staying close to the coast. Again, they're in a particular type of ship that's more of a coastal type of ship, one that's going from port to port along the coastline. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, again, you can see the tracing of the journey there on your map. We came to Myra in Lycia. You see that there. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. So the centurion is looking for a ship to take them, to make that longer journey, to go out to see a more seaworthy ship, a grain ship, as it turned out. And they find one along the coastline there, and so they get on board that ship. They transfer over to that ship that's bound for Italy. 7, we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and you can see that part of the journey there indicated on the map as well. And as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete, off Salmone, and you see the tracing of that journey there on your map. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Laodicea. And so you see where Fair Havens is on the map there. So you see the journey that they've taken to that point. All of it has been, buffeted by the wind to a certain extent, has been affected by the weather. As we're going to find out in a moment, this is early fall, and just before the winter season kicks in. And it's because the winter season is getting ready to kick in that that Paul's going to warn them about trying to carry forward with this journey. So already you get kind of a sense for the feel of the danger of this journey. Sea travel in this day, any day, but in this day, was dangerous, was uncertain, and you had to be careful. But even when you were careful, you were dealing with a lot of difficult issues. Let me stop here and say that I had referenced in one of my commentaries a book entitled The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. It's an old book. It was written in the 1800s, late 1800s. It was written by a man named James Smith, good old Scottish seaman and theologian. He had studied the journeys. He was himself very knowledgeable about sea travel. Again, this is late 1800s. He is very knowledgeable about sea travel, and he had an interest in comparing, the text with what he knew. And he also went and interviewed people in the Mediterranean, sailors who were experienced on the Mediterranean seas. And so he wrote a book entitled The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. Again, his name is James Smith. You can find it if you want. I looked it up, and you can get a copy of it if you want, if you're really interested in that kind of stuff. And what he did is he weighed the evidence of what he knew from his interviews of sailors in the Mediterranean Sea, what he knew of himself of sea travel against the text. And what he came to see was that the description that Luke gives, very, very, very accurate to real life conditions in the late 1800s. And so for him, it was a corroboration of the text, saying that, this makes sense. Plus, he adds some things that helps us to understand a little bit better. So if you're really interested in that kind of thing, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul by James Smith is a book that the commentator I use referenced in his work with this text. But again, it reiterates this is a very accurate telling of what happened in those days. Okay, to verse 9. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous, because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Stop there for a second. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by. That term, the fast, refers to the Day of Atonement. You'll hear, the Jewish name for it, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It takes place, depending on the lunar cycles of the year, it takes place late September into October. So we know from that the Day of Atonement's already been celebrated. It's past. So they're in October right now. And November, is when the seas are the most dangerous at that particular point there in the Mediterranean. So, we don't necessarily need to think that this is a word of God from Paul to the men. We can assume that Paul's making these conjectures himself. Remember, Paul has sailed a lot in those first 3 journeys that we talked about. Paul does sail at various times from one place to another place. Paul has been at sea. He knows what sea travel is about, and he understands, the times to travel and the times not to travel. So we need not think that this is necessarily an admonition of the Lord God Almighty to the party, but rather Paul, just giving his opinion about things. And so he says, "Men, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Paul is fearful about the lives of those who are traveling on the boat on this journey. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. That's a great line. It's a very subtle way of saying money wins every time, right? The owner and the pilot, they know they're taking grain to Italy. They know they're selling their product. They know this is probably, they want to get there as fast as they can. And even though they're going to have to harbor somewhere during the wintertime, they want to be in the best circumstances so that they can get away as quickly as possible when fairer weather comes their way. And so they ignore Paul and they say, well, we can at least make it to the other side of the island where there's a better port for the winter. He's hoping to get to the western side of Crete. You see there Phoenix on the western side of Crete. That's where they're trying to get to. Doesn't seem that far, doesn't seem that bad. And that's certainly what they're thinking. We can at least get there, and then we'll be better set to take off when fair seas come our way. Verse 12, since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, that is Fair Havens, the harbor at Fair Havens, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. So they're going to, it looks like a fairly easy, fairly good gamble. And so they're going to try it out. Verse 13 on the next page there. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose. So they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete close to the shore. But soon a violent wind called the nor'easter, what we would call a nor'easter, rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. You see Cauda on the map there to the south of Crete, a little tiny island. You see how they're going. They're driven to the south of Cauda. They were trying to get to Phoenix, and they've already gotten blown off course south of Cauda, right below Crete. They can't get control of the boat. Verse 17, after hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then fearing that they would run on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. The Syrtis, I had to look that one up. That's, if you look to the south there of Cauda, of Crete, the coast of Africa, Cyrene. Off the coast there are quicksand lands. And so they were afraid of being driven by the wind into the quicksand lands off the coast of Cyrene. And so they take actions to try and prevent them from being blown into that dangerous water. Verse 18, we were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Now you got to read between the lines, right? We read through these details because, they're just the details of a trip, blah, blah, blah. but they're really in a desperate situation. They're really, in rough waters, in a storm, a fierce storm. It's going to be a 14-day type of ordeal. And as we're going to see, they're being driven all across the ocean by this storm. Pause here for just a second. Remember Jonah? There's another storm that we're told about in the book of Jonah. Just hear a few verses from there. You know the story of Jonah, and he's on the ship and he's trying to get away from God's call to go to Nineveh. And so he goes in the exact opposite direction. Verse 4 of chapter 1 in Jonah. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. We're going to read another story just a second and get the parallels in all this. The captain came and said to him, "What are you doing, sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." Well, go from that story right there to a story of Jesus in Luke chapter 8. One day, Jesus got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they put out, and while they were sailing, he fell asleep. A windstorm swept down on the lake, and the boat was filling with water, and they were in danger. They went to him and woke him up, shouting, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he woke up and rebuked the wind and the raging waves. They ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" They were afraid and amazed and said to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" So the parallels there between those two things, but they both drive home the point of the sheer terror of the sailors on these boats. The last words that Luke records there, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Luke is writing from his own first-person encounter of this storm. This is no small thing. This is a huge, huge thing. What is Paul doing during all this time? Hang on to that. Go to the next page. Pick up with the text again. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, and he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, and indeed God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have found faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island.'" What's Paul been doing this whole time? In the Jonah story, Jonah goes down and falls asleep. He's trying to hide from God. And so even though the storm's kicking up outside, he's like, I'll just pretend it's not happening. I don't want God to get my attention. Jesus goes and lays down in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, and it's being whipped around and all this kind of stuff. And the disciples are saying, "What in the world are you doing?" The captain on Jonah's boat says, "What are you doing asleep down here?" The disciples say, "What are you doing down here asleep?" I can imagine Paul was probably in that same situation while the sailors are fighting to keep the boat together and fighting against the wind and the storm and the rain. Paul is most likely praying, right? He's most likely praying. As we're going to see, this is 14 days worth of storm that they're going through, a raging, raging storm. And Paul has been praying, and God has spoken to him. The first time the advice he gives seems more likely to have been his own advice. This time it comes directly from God. Last night there stood by me an angel of God, and he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, and indeed God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you." God is going to make sure Paul gets to Rome, period. And he's going to take care of the sailors who are with him too, period. In the first warning that Paul had given, one of the reasons we can say it's probably more his opinion than God's message, he warns of loss of life. But here he has a word from God, there will be no loss of life. God will provide for all of them on that ship. And as we come to find out, there are 276 of them on that ship. So keep your courage, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told. But we will have to run aground on some island. So we're not out of the thick of it yet. We're still in danger. We're going to be in danger, but don't worry. Hang in there. Have faith. God is going to see us through to the end. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, as we were drifting across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. Stop there for just a second. Look at your map. They are near to Malta. You see where Crete is, and you see where Malta is. For 14 days, they've been sailing across that wide expanse of ocean. By calculations that James Smith has done, that's about 470 miles. Imagine 14 days, night and day, raging storm, and you're being driven by the wind, and you don't know where you're going. You can't control it. And of course, they're fighting, and they're trying to control it whatever way they can. But 14 days, and they don't know where they're going to end up. And they're in the face of the storm, and they're being driven. They don't know where. This is dangerous. This is high drama kind of stuff. They are really in the path of great destructive forces. But on that 14th day, about midnight, the sailors suspected they were nearing land. Perhaps they heard breakers. Perhaps, they heard sounds of approaching shoreland of some sort somewhere. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that they might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern, the back part of the boat, and prayed for day to come. They know they're getting near land, but they're afraid they're going to run up on rocks. And so they just drop anchor, and they say, hopefully, when tomorrow comes, things will be good enough for us to see where we're going and to make headway the right way. Verse 30, but when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. They had the dinghy, the rescue boat, the boat you throw in the water when the ship's sinking. Some of the sailors had lowered into the sea. They weren't going to wait till the morning to see what might happen. They were going to get off the ship now. They were afraid that it was still going to somehow run up on the rocks. But they pretended to be going to the front of the boat to let down the anchors from the bow of the boat. But Paul says if they get off the boat, they're going to die. And so they're called back onto the boat, the ship, and the ropes are cut so that the boat drifts, the dinghy drifts away. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food. Today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food. It's not they don't have food on board, it's that they've been so tied up with fighting the storm and so anxious about their lot that they haven't been able to eat. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive, for none of you will lose a hair from your heads. Paul assures them again that they are going to be okay. After he said this, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Does that sound like anything you've heard of before? The Lord's Supper? It appears that Paul, and in a subtle sort of way, because most of the people on this ship are probably not Christians. Most of them are pagans of one sort or another. And Paul's encouraged them to eat, and he's going to start eating himself so that they can join him. But he engages in the Lord's Supper ritual. So the Christians who are on board, the message is Christ who gave his life for you is your God. He is your Savior. He will take care of you. He will provide for you, even as you have been suffering through this whole time. He will provide for you. So for those who are in the know, it's a celebration of the Lord's Supper. It's a reminder of the sacrifice of Christ, why they're going through all this trouble, and also the fact that the God who has saved them from their sins will certainly save them in the midst of their trouble. Even now, God has already assured Paul of that, and he has spoken that word to them. So he's engaged them in that ritual, that rite, those who are believers. Verse 36, then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. They're hoping to get on shore, and they're trying to take every precaution they can to get the boat on shore in the morning. In the morning, verse 39, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape. More than likely, the soldiers who were charged with keeping the prisoners and delivering them to Italy were doing so at the cost of their own lives. If your soldiers escape, you lose your life. And so they don't want to risk that. And again, we don't know the nature of all those prisoners. We know that Paul's among them. We can imagine a couple other Christians are among them, but we don't know that all of them are Christians or not. Verse 43, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, he's grown quite fond of Paul. Paul has been a source of strength for him through this whole ordeal. Kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and then the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So the ship is stuck on the reef. The waves are still pretty violent. They're breaking up the ship. They jump overboard. Those who can swim for land. Others who can't grab hold of something to float on and to try and make it to land. All of them make it to land. All 276 of them make it to land. And so God has done a mighty miracle. Now, one of the miracle is worth thinking about from a whole host of perspectives. One of those that I don't think we take often enough is the fact that the miracle doesn't spare them the trial and tribulation, but it brings them through the trial and tribulation. You know, when we have a trouble before us, we want to be delivered from it. We don't want to have to go through pain. We don't want to have to suffer. And we pray for God to take that suffering away from us. And we judge God's miracle-working ways on the basis of whether or not we had to suffer. I don't want to suffer. I don't want to have to go through this. And if God delivers us from having to go through that, then God answered our prayers. And if God doesn't answer, if God makes us go through the suffering and stuff, then we think God isn't listening to us. Well, all 276, all the Christians on board, they had to go through this suffering. They had to go through this trial and tribulation. Paul had to go through it. But God was with them, and God delivered them from it. And so it's still a miracle. It's a mighty miracle. I mean, think about it again. From the time that storm strikes, for 14 days, they're being blown across the water. They can't control their path. They can't control their circumstances. And they're just at the mercy of the winds out in the great big expanse of the Mediterranean there. And yet, God leads them to Malta, leads them to that place, leads them through that reef onto the dry land, leads them to an island that turns out to be a good place for Paul and them to be at that particular time. Mighty miracle done, but they suffered going through it. God doesn't spare us trouble, but God is with us in the face of our trouble and does mighty things through our trouble. Great story. Great story. John, you got anything to add from the sailor's perspective? Vivian, y'all have anything to? I can't imagine. That's the scariest thing in the world to me. And I'm not a sea person. I don't want to go out on the water. I don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. But that's the scariest thing. I mean, this story frightens me just to read it through. And I can't imagine. And even though Paul and all these sailors, and that's the thing, these sailors were experienced seamen, and they feel like their lives are gone. It's over. We're done for. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 470 miles worth of travel. Yeah, yeah. Shows you just how scared. I mean, scary, scary circumstances, trials and tribulations of the apostle. Safe on the other side. Now that you've written your meditation, you can write sermons, right? You're going to be doing that on a regular basis. Yeah, there's a lot to preach from on this story. Any further comments, questions? All right, we'll finish up. Paul's going to make it to Rome, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's the interesting thing about this whole thing, as we've said before. Luke goes into great detail and gets Paul all the way to Rome, and then we don't know what happened in Rome. We have no record of what happened in Rome. And why is that? One of the great mysteries. Ultimately, we don't know what all happened there. We know Paul was there. We know he preached the gospel, but we don't know what happened, and we don't know what happened, beyond Rome, if anything. We'll talk more about that next week. Our last week to be together in the book of Acts for the summer. We'll come back in September to pick up with Hebrews in our next study.